Good morning. We are talking about money matters. And in our previous discussion, we talked about the reasons why sometimes we may feel that we do not have enough. Now, of course, the word enough may be very relative. You may recall that I mentioned J.D. Rockefeller, one of the richest men who ever lived, who felt he still don't have enough. But if we are genuinely struggling financially, it may be because we have violated one or more of God's principles. For example, we may have been stingy. In Proverbs 11:24 we read, "Give freely and become more wealthy. Be stingy and lose everything." And it is just a biblical principle that the more we keep for ourselves, the more likely we are to lose it. In Proverbs 21 verse 13 we read, "Those who shut their ears to the cries of the poor will be ignored in their own time of need." And closely linked to stinginess is greed. In Luke 12 verse 15, Jesus said, "Beware, guard against every kind of greed. Life is not measured by how much you own." And again, it is also a biblical principle that the more we give, the more we receive. In Luke 6 verse 38, Jesus said, "Give and you will receive. Your gift will return to you in full, pressed down, shaken together to make room for more, running over and poured into your lap." The amount you give will determine the amount you get back. And then another reason why we may be struggling financially is because we have been too hasty. We may have been in a hurry to amass wealth via the so-called get-rich-quick schemes. Proverbs 21 verse 5 says, "Good planning and hard work lead to prosperity, but hasty shortcuts lead to poverty." Some years ago, we had a lady in our church who invested all her money in a scheme that promised to pay her 6% interest per month. That is more than 72% per annum. What made her think that people would pay her that? And she lost everything. That's why it's so important that before we make any investments, we get knowledgeable advice from a trustworthy person. Now, financial difficulties may also come because we have been lazy. Proverbs 20 verse 4 says, "Those too lazy to plow in the right season will have no food at the harvest." For example, some young people may be too lazy to study further. And then later in life, when they are struggling financially, they look at envy to some of their colleagues who took the trouble to get a better education and who then end up with better jobs. Whether we like it or not, we are still under the curse of sin that says that we have to eat our food by the sweat of our brow. Now, we have looked at ways to obtain money and some of the pitfalls that we need to avoid. But what does the Bible say about how we should spend our money? Well, first of all, we should meet the needs of our immediate family. In 1 Timothy 5 verse 8 we read, "Those who won't care for their relatives, especially those in their own household, have denied the true faith." Now, this is not talking about people who struggle to make ends meet, but rather it refers to people who spend money at the cost of their own family. Some years ago, I counseled a couple. The wife had gone to their pastor and complained that her husband was not giving her sufficient housekeeping money. And the pastor sat there feeling very guilty because he was wearing a very expensive watch that the husband had given to him. Now, there's nothing wrong with giving our pastor an expensive watch, and he asked me to stress that, but not when it is at the cost of our family. And then secondly, we need to spend our money on our Christian family. In James 2 verses 15 and 16 we read, "Suppose you see a brother or sister who has no food or clothing, and you say, 'Goodbye and have a good day, stay warm and eat well,' but then you don't give that person any food or clothing. What good does that do?" And again, whether we like it or not, we have an obligation to our fellow believers. That's why Jesus taught us to pray, "Our Father," rather than "My Father." If God cannot trust us to use His money to help others, He may well take it away from us. And then, secondly, we must pay off our debts first. Do you remember the story of Elisha and that poor widow who only had a jar of oil left? And he told her to borrow as many containers as she possibly could and to pour the oil into those containers. And the oil did not stop flowing. And when she had no more containers left, Elisha said to her, "Now sell the olive oil and pay your debts, and you and your sons can live on what is left over." And that's a sound principle. We must pay off our debts first. And then the next thing we must spend our money on is to save some of it. Saving is always associated with wisdom. In Proverbs 21 verse 20 we read, "The wise store up choice food and olive oil, but fools gulp theirs down." And I think that if possible, we should try and save about 10% of our income. And if we can't do that, it may mean that we are living beyond our means. And here's a sound principle. We must not tempt God by acting foolishly. Do you remember in Matthew chapter 4, Satan tried to tempt Jesus to jump off the temple just to prove that the angels would catch him. And Jesus said, "No, that would be tempting God." And there are people, for example, who refuse to buy insurance because they said the Lord will look after them. Well, I think they may be tempting God. And by the way, the same applies to those who refuse to be vaccinated against the COVID virus. A few hours ago, I spoke to a young pastor's wife who is still ill and has been terribly, terribly ill as a result of the COVID. And she came very close to death. But when I asked her about the vaccination, she said, "No, my husband and I don't believe in the vaccination." Well, I think that she is tempting God. And then another principle is that we need to look after our possessions. Proverbs 27 verses 23 and 24 says, "Know the state of your flocks and put your heart into caring for your herds, for riches don't last forever." For example, we need to have our cars serviced regularly, keep our house in good condition, look after our property. And then perhaps an extremely important principle, don't get into any debt of any kind. Romans 13 verse 8 says, "Owe nothing to anyone." Now, what is it about that statement that we do not understand? Now, please note, the debt that you and I have, that on our house or on our car, is not this kind of debt. The debt in that regard is the monthly repayment. And when we default on those payments, then we dishonor God. And then lastly, and perhaps most importantly, we must give some of our money back to the Lord. Proverbs 3 verse 9 says, "Honor the Lord with your wealth and with the best part of everything you produce." After all, it came from Him in the first place. James 1 verse 17 says, "Whatever is good and perfect is a gift coming down to us from God, our Father." How much should we give to the Lord? Well, that will be the topic of our next discussion. Shall we talk to our Father? Our Father, you have given us such clear principles when it comes to money. and we confess that we have often ignored those principles and then blamed you for not giving us enough. Thank you for giving us such clear and practical guidelines on how we should spend our money. Give us the determination to obey you in this very practical matter that affects us all so greatly, so that we may honor you with our money. And we ask this for your name's sake. Amen.